All right. Well, welcome everybody. We'll give you a little bit of time to catch up with us if you're joining us online. This is going to be session 2 out of 5 for this week, where we are walking through the storyline of the Old Testament. So my name is Lee Woodmansee. I'm the campus minister here. If you don't know who I am, that's me. So hopefully you have your Bibles with you. We're going to be looking at Exodus chapters 1 through the end of the book, which is a bit of a lie that we're going to look at any real part of that in depth, but we're basically going to be covering everything that's going to happen from the beginning of Exodus all the way through the end of Joshua. So if you are unfamiliar with where we are right now, the first session from last night is when we basically talked about prehistory and primeval history, all the way back from creation, all the way up until the patriarchs lead us into Egypt, where we have Joseph in Egypt. And so we're going to pick up the story now with Israel and Egypt. We're going to move forward from there. So if you didn't catch, if you don't know where we are, go check the YouTube page. You'll be able to see everything that's going on there. Hold on, because we got a lot to cover. So before we actually dive into this, I want to pray for us, and then we're going to go about an hour and 15 minutes or so to cover everything that we have here. If you got questions here, let me know. If you're watching online live, we don't have someone moderating chat, so just text me. If you're watching, we'll make it happen that way. So let me pray for us, and then we will dive into it. Father, I thank you for the opportunity to be able to crack open such a large portion of Scripture. God, I thank you that there are students here, there are people online watching live, and there are folks who are going to be listening and watching this after the fact. God, I pray that this will be beneficial. God, I pray that right now that the things that I say and the preparations that I've made over countless hours at this point, getting ready for this week, God, I pray it would be beneficial for everyone, not that I would sound well put together, but rather that it would be beneficial and comprehensible for people. God, I pray that we wouldn't get bogged down in the details, but at the same time, we would recognize how you are sovereign in all of history, and that, God, that would drive us to understand more about who you are, how you've revealed yourself through Scripture, and how you have pointed the way to your Son, and how we ultimately need salvation that comes through the Christ, that comes through Jesus. And so, Father, I pray that that would happen, and that we would see that even in the narrative structures of the books we're going to be looking at today. And so, Father, I thank you for this time. I pray that you would give me unction, and I pray that you give me clarity of thought, and I pray that this will be beneficial. And I pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so if you're following along online, if you're watching with us, you should be able to see down in the video description, there's a link to all the slides that we have there. It's in a PDF format, so you should be able to follow along with me. But what I want to do is I want to kind of walk through what it is we're going to be covering tonight. So tonight is basically going to be Israel and Egypt all the way through the end of the conquest at the end of the book of Joshua. So really that's Joshua's conquest, that's Israel's conquest of the land. Here are the major issues that we're going to be addressing. Israel in bondage in Egypt, the oppression they suffered, Moses. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on Moses just so we can get a glimpse into why he is such a monumental figure for us. The Exodus, the crossing of the sea, the covenant that is cut with God on the other side of the Red Sea. And then we're going to pick it up there with covering all of the book of Numbers in one slide with 5 points. The entirety of Numbers is going to be covered in 5 points. And that's essentially what we're going to try to do there. We're going to talk about the lost generation from Numbers as well. Then we're going to talk about Joshua from there on. Talk about Joshua taking over leadership of the nation of Israel, leading them into the promised land, Jericho, Ai, or I. Either pronunciation is good. We'll talk about the rest of the conquest of the land. And then we're going to see Joshua die in his farewell address. So we are basically going to be covering Moses and Joshua. Now, once again, whenever we look at the entire scale of what we're going to be talking about over these 5 nights, we've basically covered by this point what would be 6 books in the Bible, and that's it. However, I would just remind us that the patterns that we see generated in Genesis 1 through 11 and that get followed through for the rest of Genesis from there are going to be picked up in these stories as well, but then there's going to be new themes that are going to be added, and they set the tone for Israel's history moving forward. It's going to be really critical next week whenever we start getting into Judges, the monarchy, Saul, David, Solomon, those cats. It's going to be really important when we get to them. Yeah? So here's what we want to do. Go ahead and turn to Exodus. Well, actually, let's pick it up in Genesis. Go back to Genesis chapter 46 is where we're first going to look at. We're going to pick it up with Israel there in Egypt, and we're going to talk about how Israel was in bondage. So pick it up in Genesis chapter 46, and let's start in verse 26. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph who were born in Egypt in him were 2, and all the persons of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. So, we can start off where we begin tonight is where we basically ended last night with these 70 people in Egypt. So let's talk about what's going on there. At the end of the day, we have to recognize that while Israel was in Egypt, God was actually using Egypt to preserve his people. Now, we saw the explosion from Abram to a son and then a grandson, and now we've got 12 sons, and now we've got 70 people. And we're just starting to see that kind of exponential growth take place. And over the years, whenever Israel is there in Egypt, they are just starting to multiply. And so God is actually using Egypt to preserve his people. Now, go to Exodus chapter 1. Let's pick it up in Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. Because verses 1 through 8 in Exodus sets the historical context for everything else we're really going to talk about tonight. Let's pick it up in verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. And the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. So we see this reiteration from back in Genesis chapter 46 is already being recaptured for us. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, and Joseph was already in Egypt. And then Joseph died, and all of his brothers in that great generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. What we see there is that God is already working for Israel to be protected, and that their numbers just explode, right? And what we see from the rest of the story in Genesis is that Joseph was a revered leader in Egypt. And that's one reason why Moses here calls them all of that great generation, or that generation of renown is one way you can translate that. This was a big deal. But eventually those guys die. Well, the problem with that is a new Pharaoh eventually comes into power after Joseph. He wasn't concerned with all that. That was great that Joseph was a dude who was a foreigner who helped basically rule the kingdom. That was great, but this new Pharaoh didn't really care. And that's a problem, because that's going to set into motion everything that we think about in Exodus. That's when we think about Israel and Egypt in slavery. This really begins with them being protected and flourishing there, but it ends in their oppression. Tracking with that? I say ends. It's going to turn into their oppression. So let's look at their oppression under Egypt. Let's pick it up in verse 9 of Exodus chapter 1. Verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Who cares? I don't care about that dude. Verse 9. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us." Let me just summarize this. This new Pharaoh feared that there would be this population explosion from the people of Israel, and it would lead to an uprising of the Hebrews. Let's pause right there for a moment. Let me give some clarity. I'm going to use a couple of terms interchangeably, but I'm going to try to be as historically correct as I can be. There are 3 terms that we use to describe God's people in the Old Testament, right? The first one I just mentioned there, the Hebrews. The second term is the Israelites. And then the third term is the Jews. Do you know why we use Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews as 3 distinct groups? Alex, you're nodding your head. Whenever you refer to the Hebrews, they're just a people group out there wandering around. They were in what the land was with Abram and the patriarchs, but eventually they end up in Egypt, and they don't have a land. Plus, Jacob's name hadn't been changed yet, so we wouldn't call them Israelites because Israel didn't really exist at that point. Are you tracking with that? After Jacob has his name changed and they are constituted like as a nation, especially whenever they move into the land and they are like a constituted people group with a land, we now call them Israelites. Well, what happens whenever their land is removed from them and all that's left is Judah? We now call them Jews. So in 3 periods of history, when someone refers to the Hebrews, typically we're talking about Genesis and Exodus for the most part. And when we talk about the Israelites, we're talking about the big chunk of the Old Testament, and then the New Testament is really where we just refer to them as the Jews. They are all the same people, but those are three distinct periods of Israel's history that's really critical for us. I just want to be as clear as I can be if no one's ever explained that to you. So, Hebrews. So, this is what happens. This Pharaoh fears that there's going to be an uprising, so he starts instituting these harsh crackdowns. Look at verse 11 and 12 in chapter 1. He says, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens, and they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied." So, we can't let these guys have an uprising. Let's put them to work. Let's be really harsh. Well, problem is, Israel still flourished under those conditions. You can keep reading the next little bit, and they just keep going. Well, the next thing is in verse 13 and 14. "So they were ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service and mortar and brick and all kinds of work in the field. And all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves." It's not until after these initial crackdowns that they're officially conscripted as slaves. Now, you got to keep in mind, the population is no longer 70. We're talking about exponential growth here, like hundreds of thousands at this point. All of them are conscripted into slavery. So, the story is now set. Things look really bad. This is what we think about when we think about Israel in Egypt. This is the slavery. Pick up in verse 15 through 17. "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Sifrath and the other Puah, 'When you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, you shall let her live.' But the midwives feared God." So what happens here is slavery ain't enough to keep these people down. And so what the king, the Pharaoh, orders is that there would be a culling of Israeli boys. Get rid of all the boys, you're not going to have the population exploding eventually. And so he tells these midwives, "Hey, y'all need to get out there and start killing some of these boys." And the midwives are like, "Cool, we'll do that." And then they don't. So then the next thing you see is in verse 18 through 21. "And so the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, 'Why have you done this, and why have you let the male children live?' And the midwives said to Pharaoh, 'Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them.'" They make excuses like, "Well, they just kind of give birth at home. What am I supposed to do?" Right? Verse 20. "So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. And then Pharaoh commanded to all his people, 'Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you will let every daughter live.'" So there's this culling that's initiated, and then eventually there's this intimidation. The king is going to start coming to these midwives and saying, "You better do what I told you to do." But what we just read is that God makes the people flourish even more. And then there's this other penalty that said, okay, instead of just killing that baby boy, throw him into the Nile. And if you know the story of Moses, you know that there's this huge amount of irony that goes along with this decree from the king, right? All three of those things fail. The culling fails, the intimidation fails, and the casting the babies into the Nile. We see that happen with Moses, but it's not even the word for cast isn't even the same word that gets used for Moses when he's placed into the river. It's just a demonstration that God is having his hand over Moses even before he's born in these situations. You tracking with that? So keep in mind, Israel's exploding, things are going well for them population-wise, but not well for them as far as their work and being slaves. So now, let's talk about Moses. I'll just go ahead and say this. If you've read Exodus recently, especially in the first several chapters, there's a whole lot of living packed into these first couple of chapters for Moses. It moves quickly. The narrative is constantly on the move. And so we're going to try to mirror that as much as we can. So let's pick it up here with Moses. Pick it up in chapter 2, verse 10 and 11. So we know Moses, he's put into a basket, put into the Nile. He goes down the river. One of Pharaoh's daughters, hey, here's a baby, picks him up. And then there's this Hebrew woman that says, hey, I'll nurse him. Happens to be Moses' mom. Coincidence, right? And then Moses grows up. Let's pick it up in verse 10. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she named him Moses, Musa in Hebrew, or excuse me, in Arabic and Hebrew is very similar. It said, because she said, I drew him out of the water. And then verse 11, but one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people, and he looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And he looked this way and he looked that, and seeing no one, he struck him down. So here's the thing I want you to see, is that when Moses comes of age, he is eventually brought to this point where he realizes what his heritage actually is. He's not Egyptian. He knows it. He is a Hebrew. He comes and sees his people's affliction. And so he rolls up on looking at his people, and he sees an Egyptian abusing a Hebrew. He looks around, makes sure no one's looking, and he's going to rise to the defense of this brother of his, and he kills this guy. Look at verse 12. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Hid him in the sand. Very next verse. Verse 13, and when he went out the next day, behold, the two Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, why did you strike your companion? And he asked, who made you a prince or a judge over us? Did you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Like, yeah, I saw what you did. I know you killed the guy. And so he's confronted by these two guys that were getting abused by this Egyptian, and they basically scare him off. And so Moses then flees to Midian. He runs off from Egypt and heads essentially east. This is eventually going to be, many of the same paths are going to be where we're going to run into in Numbers. He runs to the very place we're going to see a couple books from now. Are you tracking with that? And so he runs off. He goes and he marries this chick named Zipporah, who is the daughter of the priest of Midian. He's got a bunch of daughters. Pick it up there in Exodus 2:15. We already read that. Let's not worry about that. Well, actually, we hadn't read it. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well, verse 16. And now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled it, filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And eventually we get down there to where he marries this chick in verses 19 through 21. But here's the point. In one chapter, we see Moses' life, his saving of his execution as a baby, as a newborn. We fast forward to whenever he has his confrontation with an Egyptian. He kills the guy, and then we fast forward to him running, and he runs into this place called Midian. And there's this priest who's got 7 daughters, and he ends up marrying one. A whole lot of living in these chapters. Pick it up there in verse 23 and 24. Now, during those many days when Moses was on the run, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. And their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and he knew. So God hears Israel's groaning, and now we're starting to anticipate something's going to start changing. Now, exactly how that's going to work out, we'll see in a little bit, but this is where we see that big movement of, okay, now the Exodus is about to happen. So, let's keep talking about Moses and some other things that happen with him. Eventually, that new king comes up, and whenever there's this changeover in leadership with this, there's an opportunity that maybe Moses can go back to Egypt, right? And so he's contemplating these things, and he may be able to return to Egypt, and maybe even as a prince, but things go a little bit different for him. Pick it up in chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb. It's a very important place. Horeb, the mountain of God, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And this is where we see Moses' calling from a burning bush. In this opportunity to possibly go back to Egypt, maybe even as a priest, or excuse me, as a prince, he's actually called by God, and what we're going to see here in a moment is that he's going to be told, go to Pharaoh. Okay, maybe this is good news. Problem is, he's going to go to Pharaoh, and he's going to demand the captive Israelites, or excuse me, the captive Hebrews to be released. He's going to demand that all these slaves be released. You can see in verse 7 through 11, let's pick it up. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people. Verse 8, I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Verse 9, and now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me. Verse 10, come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And what basically Moses is told to do is go, demand their release, and then what I want you to do is I want you to form a nation out of these newly released slaves. And so the promise that God makes to Moses here is the fulfillment of the promise made to Abram in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. That's later spoken over Isaac and Jacob as well. It's the same promise. I'm going to give you a people. And this is kind of crazy stuff, but here's the deal. In the middle of this conversation, Moses recognizes that the issue that he's going to face is not one of practicality. The main issue he's going to run into is a theological issue. It's like, man, whose authority am I going to demand this? Like, how are these people going to be released unless it's an act of God? And they don't even know who you are. And this is when he asks him, well, man, who am I supposed to say sent me? Pick it up in verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, who's that again? What is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, Yahweh, I am who I am, or I am that I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am, has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Now we have the theological battle is set. The one who was the God of creation back in Genesis 1 is the same God who's saying, I am demanding the release of my people now. Are we tracking with that? It's really practical that we need to see that the main issue here is not one of practicality, it's one of theology. Okay? That's the reason why the plagues are going to unfurl the way that they do, because it's not a practical argument, it's a theological argument that's being made. Yeah? Tracking with that? All right, let's drive on with Moses. So, let's pick it up in chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. Then Moses answers, but behold, they will not believe me. Verse 2, and the Lord said, what's that in your hand? A staff, a stick. He said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. Yeah, I would too. He's got this stick. He throws it on the ground. It turns into a snake. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he did so. In verse 5, that they may believe. This is a theological problem, not a practical one. He says that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Are you seeing the repetition here? Are you seeing why that keeps getting repeated? Because he has to remind them of who he is. That I have appeared to you. And again, the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. Pulls his hand out. It was leprous like snow. He puts it back. It's healed. Here's the point. Moses was given powerful signs to demonstrate his authority and the authenticity of his message. Incidentally, if you start thinking about all the crazy things that happened with the apostles in the book of Acts, those miracles and those miraculous signs were to authenticate their message and to demonstrate they had authority. That is a pattern that we see all the way from the second book of the Bible. Are you tracking with me on that? So he's given these signs, but then Moses is still hesitant. Look at verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past, since you have spoken to me, your servant, but I'm slow of speech. And the Lord said, man, who made your mouth? Why are you making these excuses? And Moses just can't get over these excuses. Verse 13. But he said, oh my Lord, please send someone else. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. Don't miss. All of these great things just happened, and now God is already fed up with Moses making excuses. Already. And so what ends up happening is Moses says, send somebody else. God says, I'm not sending anyone else to do this. You will do it, but I'll send somebody to help you. Again, there's a pattern here, right? So he says, I'm going to send Aaron with you. They go and meet together, and away they go. Here's the thing that I want to tell you about when it comes to these powerful signs. That sign with the snake, the staff turning into a snake, we're going to see that with the showdown with the Pharaoh's magicians. We see that same thing happen. The point is, the signs that we see here, the leprosy, that's all pointing to and prefiguring the plagues that are going to happen with the signs of greater value that are going to happen in Egypt. And the plagues there were to demonstrate God's power to the Egyptians. Because the primary issue is not a practical one of how do we free all these slaves. The primary issue is a theological one, right? Whose God is really God? Are you tracking with that? Basically, whenever you look at the the pantheon of Egyptian gods. The way it works out, they have a whole bunch of gods that have a whole bunch of stuff. Ra, is probably one of the ones that spring to mind the most, or Isis might be another one. But when you think about their different responsibilities, it's very similar to any other kind of agriculturally bound culture. They have all these different spheres of influence, but the deal is the Pharaoh was the one who was responsible for making sure that there was a well-maintained balance in Egypt. And so when you start looking at all the plagues, all 10 of them are basically going to be attacking that balance, their agriculture, their way of life, who it was that the Pharaoh said he was in controlling this balance in Egypt, and every bit of those things are going to start getting attacked. Again, because this is not a practical problem, it's a theological one, right? We're going to attack their theology by demonstrating actual miracles through Moses. And when that balance is overthrown, it shows that Pharaoh is not divine. He doesn't maintain anything. But this random Hebrew who ran away after killing a guy and came back 40 years later is going to be the mouthpiece for the real God. So, let's pick it up in chapter 4, verse 21 through 23. The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I've put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let my people go. And then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me, and if you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. And we're just going to fast forward through the plagues that we see, and basically everything that happens in Exodus chapter 5 all the way through about chapter 9. We're just going to fast forward through all of that stuff. But here's the deal. Those plagues that strike Egypt from chapter 7 all the way through 12, really, those are all these demonstrations of God's power over the divine claim that Pharaoh has, because it's a theological argument. Yeah? The final straw, if Israel is God's firstborn son, cool, I'll take your firstborn son. And the 10th plague that we see is the angel of death who comes. We have Passover. We'll get to that here in just a moment. But there is going to be this striking of all the firstborn sons in all of Egypt. By the way, that's also recompense for what happened with Pharaoh saying, hey, back in chapter 2, let's kill all the baby boys. You're starting to see that come back around to him, right? Just because the history here is highly stylized and literarily thick doesn't mean it's not accurate. Tracking with that? So let's keep driving on. We have all these signs, they're demonstrated. Eventually we get to this point where we're right there at the last bit of the final plague. So let's pick it up in Exodus chapter 12. The final plague is threatened in chapter 11. Chapter 12, we have the Passover that's going to be inaugurated. Look at verse 5. The lamb shall be without blemish, a male year old. You shall keep it for 14 days, and then you'll kill it. You'll take some of the blood in verse 7 and put it on the 2 doorposts on the side and above the threshold on the top, or the threshold and the bar at the top, and that's going to be a sign that there has been a sacrifice made that covers these people. Pharaoh doesn't know that's what's supposed to happen. So all the people in Egypt don't make sacrifices, but the Hebrews do. And this is where we see the Passover is inaugurated, that the angel of death will pass over the houses of the Hebrews, and that there wouldn't be this plague that would land on them, and instead it would be on all these animals and all the people of Egypt instead of the Hebrews. Yep, tracking with that? So the Passover is inaugurated, and the consecration of the firstborn is also instituted, and that's what you see in chapter 13. You can see those two things going hand in hand. So you have the plague promised, the provision of how you're going to avoid death, then you have death come, and then you're going to have a celebration of the firstborn after that in chapter 13. All of this is really critical because whenever we get to Numbers, which we're not really going to talk about too much, but the Levites, they are the ones who are taken by metaphor as God's firstborn sons out of the tribes of Israel, and they are the ones who are going to serve him at the temple, right? That goes back all the way to Exodus chapter 13. So, Pharaoh's son dies, like the angel of the Lord does for everybody else. Israel's released. That being said, if you look, by the way, historical accounts of this are going to vary wildly on numbers, but most generally accepted figures on how many people were released, how many Hebrews were released. We're talking between 2 and 3 million people. That's a bunch of people to be leading out of one desert area into another desert area. Tracking with me? So we see that the people were released, they take off, and you see in chapter 12, verse 36, let's pick it up there, verse 35, the people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked, and they plundered the Egyptians. So the Egyptians actually provide after they've just been absolutely beaten. They give them some gold, they give them some jewelry, some silver, some clothes, and off they go, right? And then as soon as we see them leaving, you can pick it up in chapter 13, the last half of it, 17 through 22. Israel now begins to follow this pillar of cloud and a pillar of smoke, right? The cloud's going to provide them shade during the day. Smoke and fire is going to lead them by night. When it stops, they stop. And they start heading east. By the way, at one point here, I meant to look it up. You'll see that on the way out, Moses actually grabs Joseph's bones that were buried there in Egypt because he made Israel, the rest of the nation, promise that they would take them with him whenever they went back home. So they knew they were going to go home at some point. He just didn't know there was going to be all these years of slavery. Yeah? So now they're on their way out, rocking on. All right, we are about a third of the way through. We're ready to roll. So let's talk about the next big event that happens in Exodus. It's the crossing of the Red Sea. So they eventually run from Egypt. They're at the borders of Egypt, as it were. There's this huge sea, and now they're hosed. Pick it up in chapter 14, verses 4 and 5. We've already seen this promised once, and now we're seeing it really come to fruition for the last time. Verse 4 says this, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all of his host, over his army, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. The Egyptians shall know that I am the one who's able to spring locks and free 2 million people because I've got so much money. No, he says, they will know that I am Yahweh. This is a theological argument, right? So he promises that he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that he would demonstrate for the last time before they leave Egypt that God is truly the one who's in charge here, not Pharaoh. Well, the problem with this is, for Israel, is Pharaoh now has them boxed in. They can't move across the Red Sea. They ain't got any boats. They can't go north because that's just more desert. They can't go south because that's more desert. And they can't go back because they can see the dust from Pharaoh's chariots chasing them. They're hosed. They have no hope, right? What we see there is, let's pick it up in verse 9. Let's just read it. The Egyptians pursued them and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army, and they overtook them and encamped them by the sea by these 2 random places. Pick it up in verse 10. And when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to God. So we see, once again, they're filled with fear. They cry out, and the pattern's been set at this point. Whenever Israel cries out, when the Hebrews cry out, God answers. Let me also just say right here, this is going to be really critical for us. Pick it up in verse 11. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us out here to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you when we were in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it is better and has been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And Moses, doing his best to hold them together, says, fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today you shall never see again. Here's what I want you to see. The seeds of grumbling that's going to be filling the pages of Numbers start right here, right at the border of the Red Sea. They're already complaining. We told you this is why we didn't want to leave Egypt. They were going to hunt us down. But what Moses says is, trust God and see his salvation. So then in chapter 14, 21 through 26, Moses stretches out his hand. This wind blows, the sea parts, Israel crosses the Red Sea, and all of that was a demonstration of God's power. This is not a practical problem, it is a theological problem. Yes? Am I beating this horse sufficiently? So that we're seeing how this is all working out, yeah? So, they cross the Red Sea, everyone makes it on the other side. the wind stops, the waves crash in, Pharaoh's army is destroyed. There's this great salvation. But here's the next problem. When they left Egypt, they had nothing in their hands. They had some clothes, maybe some silver, maybe some jewelry, maybe some gold, maybe that, but that ain't going to help you out in the desert. They had made no long-term provisions for their survival, right? That's a problem when you got 2 million people to feed. When you're in a desert, that's a problem. So this is what we see. Pick it up in chapter 14, verse 30 and 31. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. And Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, and so the people feared the Lord. The theological argument is won out. Not only against the Egyptians, but also the Hebrews. Their fear is no longer Pharaoh chasing them. Their fear and their reverence is rightly directed to God. And they feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. And so what we see from there, and what's going to follow in the next bit of Exodus and into Numbers especially, is that reliance upon God is what is pivotal. The theological argument being made is that God, Yahweh, is the one true God, and that his power is the one who saves and is judging you. So rely upon him and fear him. That's the pattern we're going to see over and over again, that Israel, that the Jews, that we screw up over and over. We tracking with that? All right, so let's hold off right there. Y'all got any questions in this room? Rock on. Yep, go ahead. Yeah. What's the time? So what's the time frame from going from Joseph's family into 2 million? Man, it ranges wildly. Now, here's the problem. Whenever you look at archaeological evidence, there is all sorts of different names that we see from Hittite pottery and other archaeological ruins that none of them are actually what we would call Hebrews or Israelites. They don't ever use that name because they're using whatever Akkadian language that they're speaking, right? There seems to be at least about 300 years. That's my best estimation. The way I would answer it, there's enough time. I don't know how we actually parse that out, but there's enough time for them to go from this relatively small band of Joseph and his 11 other brothers and their kids to now this nation that Israel has been, the Hebrews have been led out by Moses. That's where we land. Cool? All right. So what happens whenever they get on the other side of the Red Sea? This is where we're going to pick it up in Exodus chapter 16. All sorts of cool stuff happens in 15. You should go read it. It's the Song of Moses. There's a great song by Aaron Keyes named the Song of Moses. I know we sing it here. That's hearkening back to this. It's a good song. Go check it out. So let's talk about this covenant that is actually cut with God and Israel on the other side of the Red Sea. Here's the first thing you need to see in chapter 16. There they set out from Elim, and the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which was between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month, and they had departed from the land of Egypt, and the whole congregation of Israel grumbled. Here we go again, man. We just grumbled on the other side of the Red Sea. We're going to grumble on this side too. That's going to be a problem. We're going to keep seeing that, right? He says, and the people of Israel said to Moses and Aaron, would that we had died in the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by meat pots and ate bread to the full. You brought us out in the wilderness to kill us and this whole assembly with hunger. They ain't got nothing to eat. And so what God does is he provides manna and water. Manna is this bread. Manna in Hebrew, manah, means what is it? There's these little things that would show up in the morning and they didn't know what it was. And what would you call a thing that you didn't know what it was? What's that? Right? I think there's actually like an African proverb that's what the name of a zebra is in pretty much every language. It's not true, but like there's an African proverb of whatever your tribe's name for the zebra is, they all mean, what's that? Because it's weird. No one, like the first time you see it, it's like, man, what is going on with this thing, right? That's what's happening with this bread. What's that? Manna. There's this bread that it would sustain them. And we'll see the quail that will come later on, but there's this bread and there's this meat. So God provides for them in chapter 16. There's also water that's given to them. We're not going to get bogged down in the details from there, but that happens in chapter 17, where Moses hits a rock, water comes bursting out. It's a good day, right? All sorts of good stuff happens from there. There's something crazy that happens in chapter 17, though. I think a lot of us, we think about the wars that are fought. Maybe we might think about Numbers, but we would really look to like Joshua and Judges and maybe David, and we see Israel fighting wars. But at this point, we're talking about the Hebrews. There's actually their first battle. Pick it up in chapter 17, verse 8. And then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. And so Moses said to Joshua, oh, who's this cat? Hold on to him. Said to Joshua, choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of a hill with a staff in my hand. And so Joshua did as Moses told him. And this is the story where Moses is holding up his staff, and when his arms are being held up, they win, right? But we actually see here in chapter 17, there's a victory provided over the Amalekites from basically day one of their freedom from Egypt. They already are having to fight. And what we said earlier was that reliance upon God is what is the pattern that's going to be set as to how they're going to flourish, and we see that here. Verse 11, when Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. That's reliance upon God, right? That's the figure that's being shown here. That's the pattern we're starting to see established. Tracking with that? Eventually, we end up going to the next big stage in chapter 19. Go ahead and turn to chapter 19, verse 7. Let's pick it up there. So Moses came, he called the elders before, and he sat down before them all, and he said these words that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together, and they said, all that the Lord has commanded we will do. Moses eventually goes to the top of Mount Sinai, and he receives what is the covenant that God will give to Israel, to his people, to the Hebrews. And so Moses, after hearing from God up on top of the mountain, he comes down, gets all the elders, says, hey guys, this is what we're going to do. And this is the thing. When he relays the terms of the covenant to the elders, they all wholeheartedly endorse and say, whatever you said that God told us to do, we're going to do every bit of it. Now, we know they won't. But let's just look back at the patterns we have seen just from Genesis already. How many times have we seen God make a covenant with his people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and that they screwed it up? They fell into sin, but yet God continued to bless them. So we shouldn't necessarily see that there's going to be a seed change here, that God is going to make them, or make this covenant with them, and then when they fail, he's just going to be done with them. No, we should anticipate that pattern is going to keep happening. That's not to say that we should presume upon the grace of God, but it is to say those design patterns that have already been laid out for us in the previous book and a half are coming to play here with the nation as a whole. Tracking with that? So, God delivers this covenant to Moses. Moses gives it to Israel. Israel says, yep, we'll do it. And what happens here is this crazy thing that happens, that the whole mountain of Israel is fenced off. Like literally there's guards placed around there, and basically they're told, hey, don't get on this mountain or you're going to die. And not just you, but like if your goats wander out there, your goat's going to die. That's a demonstration of God's holiness. And during this time, we actually see that Moses brings Aaron up on the mountain, and Aaron is now made a priest before God. So Aaron, who has already been a mouthpiece for Moses, is now going to be the mouthpiece for God to the people. Are you tracking with that? How that role is kind of in many ways reversed, right? Where Moses and Aaron were going to be speaking on behalf of the people to God, and from the people and God to Pharaoh, and now Aaron's elevated to this point of interceding between the people and God as well. Tracking with that? And that's a pattern we're going to see repeated over and over as well. So, Aaron's brought up there. Then we have what we call the Decalogue. The Decalogue are the 10 laws, the 10 commandments. This is what happens in chapter 20. We see the giving of the 10 commandments, running all the way from chapter 20, verse 1, all the way through 17. Yeah, that's good stuff. That's great stuff. Pick it up in in Exodus chapter 32, though. Because what happens in Exodus 20 all the way through 31 is just a whole bunch of laws that are given, and these are basically the rules of how the people are going to relate to God and what the covenant actually looks like. But look ahead to chapter 32, because all this is going on the mountain, right? Moses has been up there for a while. Chapter 32, you maybe see a subheading right there that gives the whole game away. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together and to Aaron and said to him, "Get up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, this man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him." If God and this whole thing has been a theological argument, the fact that homeboy isn't back, he's dead on that mountain, that's proof that God ain't real. So give us something that we can see, and we'll say that's our God. And so everybody gathers all that silver and all that gold they stole from the Egyptians, and what do they do with it? They bring it together, they melt it down, and Aaron makes this golden calf. So we can see just even in this one slide where God's faithfulness is being demonstrated to Israel of providing them not only food, water, victory on the military battlefield that they're going to run across, he's going to deliver this covenant, he's going to demonstrate that he's going to bless them, and before this thing even gets rolling, they already fail. Are you tracking with that? Like, that's a pattern that we should see over and over, and that's to demonstrate to us how gracious God is. Not that we should presume upon his grace, but to say this is us as well. This is us too. Let's not miss that. So, this golden calf incident. Let's pick it up in chapter 32. There's some crazy stuff that happens here. Basically, Moses gets in front of the people. He sees what's going on, and God's like, "Get out of the way, Moses. I'm going to kill everybody. I'm going to kill everyone. You and me, we're going to start over." Which, by the way, that is not an idle threat. It's not an idle threat. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down," verse 7, "Go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They've turned aside quickly." Verse 9, the Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, and behold, they are stiff-necked. Now therefore leave me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and that I may consume them, in order that I might make a great nation of you." God says, "I'm killing everybody. Moses, me and you are going to do this." Don't think that's an idle threat, because God has already started the world with one dude once, with Adam. We saw corruption all the way to Noah's day in chapter 6 of Genesis. He basically does the same thing there with Noah. He kills everyone except 8 people there. Why would we not think that God's actually going to do it? This golden calf incident is pivotal for Israel, especially whenever we're going to get to the 3rd and the 4th session. This golden calf is going to be revisited in Dan and in Bethel in the northern kingdom. It's going to come right back. It's the exact same sin. Verse 11, "But Moses implored the Lord, and he said to his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent, he brought them out to kill them, and the mountains to consume them for the face of the earth?'" Like, if you do this, that theological argument that you are better and that you are true goes away. Now, I don't think this is like Moses in the real gotcha moment with God. I don't think that's what's going on here. But I do think that's the argument that Moses is making. This is a theological argument back in Egypt. Well, if you now undo all that work and you kill everybody here, that argument goes away as well. They're going to say, yeah, we had that really weird incident where the sea swallowed everybody up, but, he really was no God after all, because all of his people died out in the desert. Are you tracking with the argument? Verse 14, "The Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken to his people." Verse 15, "Moses turned and went down the mountain. He had the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand. Tablets were the work of God." Verse 16, verse 17, "When Joshua heard the noise of the people and he shouted, he said to Moses, 'There's a noise of war in the camp.' He said, 'It's not the sound of shouting or for victory or the sound for cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear.' And as he heard," verse 19, "and as soon as he came near the camp, he saw the calf and dancing, and Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, and he broke them at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf that they had made, and he burned it with fire." I don't know how you burn it with fire. I know you can melt gold. I think that's the idea here. So this calf that they had melted down all the earrings and everything, and they made a golden calf, he melts it down. But then the next thing, he melted it with fire, and he burned it with fire, and ground it to powder, and he scattered it on the water, and he made the people of Israel drink it. You want your God? Drink it. And he makes every single person in the camp drink their idolatry. I don't know what kind of sickness happens from that. I know that there is gold leaf that is edible. You can eat gold in small amounts. And there's 2 million people here, so maybe we're talking about a small amount for everyone, but I think the whole point here is that we are demonstrating that this sin for the nation was for everyone. Aaron's confronted. Basically, he's like, how did this happen? And Aaron said, let not the anger of the Lord burn. Verse 22, you know the people, they are set on evil. And they said to me, make for us gods who should go before us. And as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. So I said to them, let any of you with gold take it off. And they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and behold, this calf. Aaron, you cowardly liar. That's not how this works. The guy who just got elevated to be a priest before the people is lying to Moses' face saying, man, this is the craziest thing. So, I mean, they wanted this God, so I was like, I don't want to do it, but since y'all are making me, give me all your gold. We'll put it in the fire, and if something pops out, then okay. That's not how this works. They worked at it the same way that Moses worked at undoing it. So Moses is going to lose it with these people, right? He's going to lose it. He makes them drink this. And there we go. But what happens from the rest of that time, there is fidelity that is restored at some point through this process. The covenant is then cut, and that the instruction that was up on top of the mountain is delivered to the people of how they're going to build the tabernacle, how priests are supposed to work, how they're supposed to relate to slaves, all sorts of stuff. Everything that we saw back from chapter 20 all the way through here are the laws that are given. Here's the next big thing that happens. God orders Israel to leave. Going back to Genesis 12, I'm going to give you a land. Let's get to that land. That's the whole goal, right? That's the whole goal. I've freed you from Israel or from Egypt so that I can take you to the land, the promised land. I'm just going to refer to it as the land. We're going to get to that land. But here's the deal. Pick it up in chapter 33, verse 3. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. God says, you know what, Moses? Let's go to the land. But here's the deal. Y'all can go, but you're going to go without me, because I'm not going. Because if I go with you, I'm going to kill every one of y'all. Because what just happened with that golden calf, that same type of stuff is going to happen again. Pick it up in verse 4. When the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments. And for the Lord had said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, you're stiff-necked. For a single moment I should go among you, I would consume you. Take off your ornaments, and I may know what to do with you. And therefore the people of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments there from Mount Horeb onward. So all that gold, all that silver, all the stuff they took when they plundered Egypt, it's done away with. They had to drink their idol before. And now the last vestiges of that idolatry of the things they took from Egypt, they no longer have. And so now God can work with them. And you can even see that the tent of meeting there in verse 7 is the next thing that we're going to see being built. So then they start the journey. They're on their way. They're finally on the way to the promised land. Pick it up in chapter 34, verses 1 through 9. Moses is given new tablets. The Decalogue is given again, because remember he slammed those two on the ground and they shattered. So now they had the broken law, the broken law in front of them. And so they got to get some new ones. And so Moses goes back up on the mountain. He makes them. And so God gives him these tablets. And then in the rest of chapter 34, there is this reaffirmation of the covenant. You can pick that up in chapter 34, verses 10 and onwards from there. But what happens this time is something crazy happens. That as Moses is up on the mountain with God, getting these tablets, hearing the confirmation of the covenant, Moses eventually comes back down the mountain. But this time he doesn't come down and slams the tablets on the ground. Something else happens. Pick it up in verse 29 of chapter 34. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and from with the two tablets of the testimony in his hand as he came down from the mountain, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. Homeboy's face is bright. He is glowing because he has been in the presence of holiness, and his face is beaming. In fact, it freaks everybody out. Like the people that he's talking to cannot stand to be around Moses because they recognize there's something clearly different about him and them. And they have to have this dude put a veil over his face so he doesn't freak everyone out. That's another element of the evidence that shows that reliance upon God and faithfulness to Him, that's what leads to blessing. Because whenever we see them recommitting to the covenant and it being reaffirmed by God, then we see Moses' face shining. But whenever he was up on the mountain with the tablets before and he comes down, there's idolatry, that doesn't happen. But now that reliance upon God is being demonstrated. Yeah? So then they make the tabernacle. We see the instructions for how that's supposed to happen in chapters 36 all the way through 40. That's basically the prefiguring of the temple. This is the mobile temple as it is. The tent of meeting is being constructed there in 36 all the way through 40. We're tracking with that? That brings us to the next big movement. We're finally on the move. We are finally getting out of Egypt. We're on the other side of the Red Sea. Now we're going to start talking about numbers and 5-minute movements. So before we get to that, any questions that I can answer at this point? Are you starting to see some of the patterns? Are you starting to see how those literary devices that are being used from previous sections in Genesis and Exodus are starting to come to fruition? All right. So Exodus. Right after Exodus is Leviticus. We're not going to worry about Leviticus because everything from from Exodus chapter 32 all the way through Numbers 9, Numbers 10 is basically a 1.5 to 2 year period, and everything in Leviticus is contained within that, and that's how the people are supposed to relate to God. So narratively, we're just going to move on to the next big thing. So we're going to talk about the entire book of Numbers in 5 major steps. 1, Israel's at Mount Sinai, which is everything we just talked about with the golden calf, the tablets, the second set of tablets, and then they eventually leave. So what we see in Numbers 1 through 7-ish is where we see them at Sinai, and then they take off on their first road trip, and things go south. It goes real bad for them there. Let's pick it up in Numbers. Pick it up in chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11, verse 1. And the people complained. That's a whole other set of way to describe the book of Numbers. The people complained. And when they complained, it goes bad, okay? So they take off on their first road trip, they take off, and it immediately goes south. During that road trip, they eventually have all sorts of craziness happen. There's this opposition to Moses. These quails are given, like, hey, this man ain't cutting it anymore, give us some meat. And God's like, okay, you want meat? I'll give you meat so much that when you eat it, it's going to be coming out your nostrils. Get you some quail, eat. Like, we can already see this aggravation that God talked about. Man, if I spend one more day with you people, I'm going to kill you all. He doesn't quite do that, but he does make them puke quail through their nose, as it were. You can go read that in chapter 11, verses 31 through 35, if you think I'm lying there, okay? So, after they get done with this first road trip, they eventually land to a point where they got to have some spies sent into the land. So they are right there on the edge of Canaan, the land of Canaan, the promised land. So they send out a bunch of spies. 10 of them come back, has a bunch of cowards saying we can't do it, and 2 say we can do it. Those 2 are Caleb and Joshua, the same guy who led the battle back up against the Amalekites in Exodus chapter 17, yeah? So we're going to see them come up again. So chapter 13 is where we see that report. But after this first road trip, they get to this random spot. They hold down in the wilderness of Paran. In the wilderness of Paran, again, bad things happen. The report of the spies says, hey, it's bad. We can't do it. And then in chapter 14, the people absolutely rebel against Moses and rebel against the leadership of Israel at that point, the leadership of the nation. God judges them. A whole bunch of people die. Crazy stuff happens. Moses intercedes, and then God promises, you know what, this entire generation, I'm going to kill every one of y'all. I told you I was going to kill everyone. I'm going to hold back. But because there were 2 of y'all who said we can do this, and 10 of y'all that said we couldn't, the 10 of y'all stand in for the generation that came out of Egypt, I'm going to kill every one of y'all. You've seen the theological arguments I made then. I'm not going to let that go to waste. Y'all will die, though. The new generation that has faith, they will live. That'll make hay for us later on. So that first road trip in Numbers 10 through 12 goes bad. They're in the wilderness of Paran. Then eventually they take off to the next place, and they land eventually at the plains of Moab. So we have Sinai, first road trip, Paran, second road trip, the plains of Moab. Problem is, in that second road trip is like 40 years. It's like 40 years, and all that generation dies. So there's not a whole lot of really cheery commentary coming out of Numbers. But there's a lot of patterns that we've seen already in Genesis and Exodus that are going to be repeated all the way through Numbers. Go read it. So let's talk about the plains of Moab. In fact, we're going to look at one story to highlight all this. Go look at chapter 22. There's this story of this cat named Balak, who is a king, and he summons this cat named Balaam, or Balaam, to come and speak a word of cursing over the people, right? However, this whole story in Numbers 22 through 24 is Balaam cannot speak an ill word against Israel. He gets up there ready to say what he's going to say, and God just says, actually, those people right down there, I'm going to bless them. And here's this pagan prophet, as it were, speaking a word of blessing, and this king is flipping out. But here's the deal. This whole story with these, 2 million people that left left slavery in Egypt, across the Red Sea, and they eventually get to where they are. There's this numbering that happens with all the fighting men that we see there. They are constituted as this huge force, and the whole incident in chapters 22 through 24 demonstrate that there was national panic for the people in Canaan. Like the land of Canaan, they are trembling because there is this huge fighting force who is ready to take over this entire land, and they are looking for every opportunity to halt them when they can. And they're resorting to witchcraft, essentially, to try to curse Israel. Tracking with that? This is in contrast to how we've already seen in Genesis and especially in Exodus that reliance upon God and obedience to Him is actually what's going to be the conduit of blessing. Here, Balaam and Balak, they're looking for any opportunity to curse them so that they can get out alive. Tracking with that? All right, so that's all Numbers, all in one shot. Let's talk about this lost generation one quick moment. In Numbers, there is this pattern of where there is this success and faithfulness initially that leads to them eventually failing at some point. Grumbling is typically the way it's talking about. And they fail, and then what happens from there is there's these additional laws given about how the people are going to relate to each other and to God. That's why Numbers has this really weird mix of narrative, and then these periods of law are given in the middle of it, and then we go back to narrative. It's because they were doing right, then they weren't. Now we got to get some new rules about what we're supposed to do. It's kind of like my kids. Tell them to go play outside. I'll be out there watching them. I'll tell them, hey, be good. Don't do anything you're not supposed to. And then I look down, happened today, and my youngest has hit my oldest in the face with a little plastic wiffle ball bat because they were sword fighting. Okay, well now we got to have new rules. Let me be explicit. No sword fighting in the backyard because you hit each other in the face. That's a problem, right? So there's initial success that leads to failure, and now we got new rules and we can't do that anymore, right? That's basically what happens. God promised that this faithless generation would not enter the promised land. That's all the way back in chapter 14 of Numbers. Make no mistake, Moses is part of that group. Moses actually suffers the exact same fate. He gets to stand on the very edge of the land of Canaan on a mountain. He gets to look into it, but he does not get to enter it. He does not get to enter it. The faithful generation are going to be led by Joshua. And that's where we're going to see the linking to Joshua. Let's pick it up there in Deuteronomy 34, just real quick. Turn all the way past Numbers to the very end of Deuteronomy, essentially. Deuteronomy 34, starting in verse 9. 1 through 8 is talking about the death of Moses. Verse 9, and Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, and for Moses had laid his hands on him. And so the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there's not arisen, again, a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Here's how we know that Moses wrote the majority of Deuteronomy, all the way the first 5 books, but he couldn't have written this because he was dead, right? And we can't say that no prophet has arisen since Moses if Moses is still alive. Like, he clearly didn't write this part, so there's a later editor, but this is how we stitch those 5 books together. Boom, it now comes to a close. Moses is dead, and now we got Joshua in charge. Yeah? Tracking? All right, we're going to burn through the last bit of this. This is going to have to be really quick. All right. Joshua assumes leadership. He had served as Moses' right-hand man. He was the guy who actually led the battle against the Amalekites there in Exodus chapter 17. We'd already talked about that. Just go back to that. He had actually had his name changed from Hoshea to Joshua in the meantime there. You can go look at that in Exodus 17 and following from there, yeah? So he is his right-hand man. He is one of the two spies who had given a good report. So he is the guy who is the best candidate to take over for Moses. And not only that, he's actually chosen by Moses. You can go read in Deuteronomy 34, and you can see that. But what happens is in the very opening of Joshua, the book of Joshua, immediately after the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses, as it were, you have this connection between the end of Deuteronomy and the beginning of Joshua. Right, so he assumes leadership, and this book is linking those two together. Pick it up in verse 1 of Joshua chapter 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses is dead, and the land that I am giving to them and to the people of Israel. I'm sorry, I'm skipping stuff. Now arise and go over the Jordan, you and these people into the land. Verse 3, every place the sole of your foot treads upon, I'm going to give to you from the wilderness, all this area. Verse 6, be strong and courageous. Verse 7, only be strong and courageous. Verse 9, only be strong and courageous. Don't be frightened. Do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. The continuation of the theme of Exodus is that this is not a practical problem, it's a theological problem. That exact same merit is now given to Joshua, saying, this is not a practical problem. Will you be obedient to me? Will you be with me? Will you fear me and not them? Because this is a theological issue. Tracking with that? And the whole book unfolds in that way. So, as soon as Joshua takes over command, he was told by God, hey, wherever your foot lands, that's your land. Well, what's Joshua going to do? He's going to move quickly to invade the land. That's what he was told to do. And so Joshua gets this rap as being like a man of war. Well, yeah, he is. But let's not miss, that's because that's what God told him to do. Like the conquest of the land was supposed to be on Moses' shoulders. He failed. He's dead in the desert, but not Joshua. So, let's pick it up in chapter 3. Joshua in chapter 2, he sends out some spies to go into Jericho. They're right on the other side of the Jordan, on the east side of the Jordan, on the west side of the Jordan, there's Jericho. That's the next big city. That's the first big problem. So what Joshua does is he sends a couple of spies. He learned from his lesson. He doesn't send 12 dudes. You know how many he sends? 2. Why does he send 2? Because last time only 2 of y'all were smart enough to rely on God. So I'm going to pick 2 as a sign of that's what we should have done way back when, 40-something years ago, right? So here we are. He sends in these 2 spies. Rahab is this prostitute there. You can pick it up in chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. She had already heard about Israel. Let's read verse 8 and 9. Before the men lay down, she came upon them on the roof, and she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us and all the inhabitants of the land. She had heard about what had all happened in Egypt. She had heard about what happened with the crossing of the Red Sea. She had heard about Sinai. And everyone knew it. And so Rahab's like, clearly God's with you. She got the theological argument. What can I do to help? She hides the spies. She does, basically she cuts a deal with them for her to be saved. She hides these guys. They eventually make it out alive. And then basically when the spies get back to Joshua, they say, hey, the land's as good as ours. Let's go get it. Which is exactly what Joshua and Caleb said all the way back in Numbers as well. So we can see those themes being replayed with the faithfulness and those who are actually reporting good things, right? So in Joshua chapter 3, Joshua says, all right, let's get the ark. Let's go. We're across the Jordan. God, in many ways, repeats the exact same signs and miracles that he did for Moses in crossing the Red Sea. He does the exact same thing for Joshua crossing the Jordan. The water is stopped. The people walk across on dry land. He miraculously does all of these things because this is him showing this is a theological argument, not a practical one. And if you get that I am the one who is doing these things, nothing's going to stop you. Tracking with that? So now all of Israel crosses over from the east side of the Jordan. Now they're on the west side, and the only thing between them and Jericho is open air. That's it. But we got more work to do before we get there. Joshua in chapter 4 sets up these Ebenezer stones, these stones of remembrance for them to remember exactly how God had demonstrated his faithfulness and his power to them. He set it up there and he says, hey, whenever your kids ask what's up with these stones piled up, you're going to tell them the story of how God showed his power over the nations and provided for us. Yeah? Once again, you're starting to see those patterns coming out over and over again. Something crazy happens in chapter 5, though. Chapter 5, verse 1. As soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan, and the people of Israel, they crossed over, their hearts melted. Verse 2, and the Lord said to Joshua, now's the time to attack. And he said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel a second time. Wait, what? Like, didn't we just read in verse 1 that now's the time to attack? They are freaking out because we made it into their territory. And God says, yeah, about that. Ain't a practical issue. It's a theological one. Do what I told y'all to do. Show your covenantal faithfulness to me. You need to go get your boys, every one of them. I don't care how old they are. If they're not circumcised, do it. So they make flint knives. They circumcise the entire nation, all the boys. And then they got to wait around for a little bit to heal, frankly, right? What do you think's going on with Jericho at this point? Like, shouldn't something be happening? Shouldn't this battle be joined, and shouldn't the fight happen? God's making a point here that it's about spiritual fidelity to him, and that's what's far more important than the tactics that are going to be involved, right? So what ends up happening is that there are 40,000 Israelite or Hebrew soldiers. I'm going to start calling them Israelites because we're kind of in that vein now. These 40,000 Israelites gather right before Jericho. Joshua circumcises everyone. And then one other thing happens in chapter 5. Pick it up in verse 10. And while the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, encamped, because they're not moving a lot, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening in the plains of Jericho, and the day after the Passover on that very day they ate the produce of the land and the unleavened cakes and the parched grain, and the manna ceased. So he circumcises them, shows their spiritual fidelity to God. They keep the Passover. There's this first time that the Passover is being celebrated in the land, and immediately after that, the manna ceases. God stops giving them food, not because God's not providing for them, but because God's providing for them through the land, like he said he would. You don't need the manna anymore. You got the land flowing with milk and honey. Eat the produce here. I'm going to give this to you. You don't need the manna anymore. Spiritual fidelity is far more important than tactics. Are you tracking here? We see that by this weird plan. Hey, we're going to take this city with 40,000 dudes. Yeah, cool. You got a band and some trumpets? Let's march around this city for a while. There's this crazy plan that's going to be drawn up that's going to happen, but before we actually see that, we're going to see yet another indication of spiritual fidelity. Pick it up there in Joshua chapter 5, verse 13. And when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes. He's getting ready to figure out what we're going to do. He lifted up his eyes, and behold, a man was standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, hey man, are you for us or are you against us? And the man said, no. No what? Like there wasn't a yes or no question. Like, are you for us or against us? No. But I am the commander of the Lord, or the army of the Lord, and now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face, and he worshiped him. This mysterious dude shows up, and he just so happens to be the pre-incarnate Christ. So when we see spiritual fidelity being drawn up with circumcision, the Passover, manna is ceasing, the land is already starting to be given to them. They are a nation in many ways already. Now we see the Lord himself show up and say, I'm here now. And Joshua sees what's going on, and he drops to his knees, and he worships him. This is what we would call a theophany or a Christophany. This would be in a physical appearing of God. If it's Christ, the pre-incarnate Christ, we call it a Christophany. If it's God in some way, it's a theophany. But here you can see the spiritual fidelity playing out. Are you tracking with me? All right, let's blow through Jericho. This odd battle plan's drawn up. You got a band. Let's get them together. Chapter 6. Let's start marching around this joint. And on the 7th day, we're going to march a whole bunch, and we're going to yell, and the walls are going to fall down. We win. Okay, cool. What's the point there? Obedience, not sound tactics, are what wins the day. You see the exact same thing happen with Gideon years and years later. Hey, man, you got a whole bunch of fighters? Cool. I don't need 10,000. I need 300. Get rid of everybody else. Cool. You got your guys? Cool. Go get some torches and some pots. That's what I need. What are you talking about? We need swords. No. You need torches and you need pots. Because the issue is obedience, not sound tactics. So we see Jericho falls. Joshua honors Rahab's contributions to hide the spies. Jericho is taken. And here's the next thing we need to see. Pick it up in chapter 6, verse 21. I'm telling you, we're going to start speeding up a lot here. Verse 21. Verse 20, so all the people shouted, the trumpets were blown, and as soon as the wall was flat and it fell down, the people went up into the city, and every man straight before him, and they captured the city. Verse 21, and they devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, all with the edge of the sword. The city is now devoted to destruction. This is the phrase that gives most people the problems that they have with the book of Joshua, that this seems like God is allowing genocide. There's a whole theological argument as to this was a period of time where their wrath was being stored up for them, that they had been increasing in injustice, and so now God's finally judging these people, so it's not genocide in the way we think of it. But make no mistake, being devoted to destruction means utterly destroyed. And that's what happens. Everything is burned. Everyone but Rahab is killed. The only things that make it out are gold, silver, and bronze. Incidentally, the very things that they were told to cast off after they left Egypt. But now that they're spiritually in faithfulness with God, He's going to give them what they need to move forward. Right? You tracking with that? So Jericho is not this paradigm of how the battle plan is going to be won, but this is the paradigm, and it sets the pattern for how all the conquest is going to happen in the book of Joshua. Because if you look in the book of Joshua, there's really only about 3 battles that are really described. That's because we're meant to read the pattern of spiritual fidelity and us understanding how obedience to God leads to victory, and then we can extrapolate the rest of the conquest from there. Does that make sense? Here's my illustration for that. The very next issue or next city we're going to run into is Ai, or Ai. I'm going to call it Ai. Ai in Joshua chapter 7 is the next big city. So what happens there is that Joshua sends out a couple of spies. Those spies come back and they say, hey, we don't need a ton of people. Let's send a small force. We'll take it over. No big deal. They eventually send that small force and they get whipped. That small force gets whipped. And Joshua's sitting there scratching his head thinking, what are we doing? I thought the whole plan here was that if we were obedient to God, He would give us what we needed. This is what was wise. What happened? Pick it up in Joshua chapter 7, verse 1. But the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things from chapter 6 with the fall of Jericho, the city, those things were devoted to destruction. They didn't do what they were supposed to, for Achan, the son of Camri, the son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things, and the anger of the Lord burned against the people of Israel. So they're defeated. Why? Because they had poor tactics? No, because it's a theological issue. They were not obedient. They were supposed to devote all these things to destruction. The rest of chapter 7, there's this scene where Joshua gets everybody together. And at this point, he already knows who has it. He knows Achan has it. And so they basically have this theater go on for the entire nation where they start eliminating different tribes. And they go from Judah, and then they go to this clan, and they go to this family. And then they eventually show up at Achan's tent, and it's going by lot. So we're going from 100 people down to 50, down to 20, down to 10, down to 2. And he points at Achan and says, what'd you do? The thing is, there was already some of Joshua's men who had already dug up all the stuff in Achan's tent. He already knew. What happens in chapter 7 is this is a demonstration of this is how deadly disobedience to God is. And so Achan is punished for his sin. Chapter 8, we see that after, this is all the stuff that I just talked about there. Achan is stoned, he is judged, and eventually after that, chapter 8, their disobedience, that then leads to obedience, and now they defeat Ai in chapter 8. We don't get a whole lot of detail of how the battle actually works. We know that Joshua is going to send his full force against Ai this time, and when he sends everybody there, it's going to be about 30,000 men. They're going to wait at night. They're going to draw out all of their people, all of Ai's defenders, and they're going to feign a retreat. And then whenever everybody hops off their horses, every one of them get cut down to where 12,000 people from Ai get killed in a single night. The whole point of Joshua 7 and 8 is to show us that tactics are not what's important. Spiritual fidelity and obedience to God is. Yes, because this is not a practical problem, it's a theological one. Here we see the inhabitants are once again devoted to destruction. The Israelites, they take the livestock. The king of Ai is hung. Second major city down. Are you tracking with this so far? Any questions? I hadn't seen any come through on text, so we're just going to roll through before we run out of time. All right, so this is what happens for the rest of the book of Joshua. There's these preparations that are made for the remaining battles. You can look in Joshua chapter 8, verses 30 through 35, and that's going to be our first point. So after the fall of Ai, pick it up in verse 30. And at that time, Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the people of Israel, as is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones. They built it the right way. And then he says there in verse 33, and in all Israel, sojourners and all the native born, the elders and officers, judges, and they stood opposite of the sides of before the Levitical priests and the Ark of the Covenant, and they renew the covenant. Are you tracking with this? So after God has given them victory because of their obedience, he reaffirms this is what we're going to do. We're never going to do Ai again. We ain't doing it that way, guys. Let's reconfirm and reaffirm the covenant that God made with us, and he renews the covenant there at Mount Ebla. Yeah? The entire book of the law was read. So at this point, basically Genesis all the way to Deuteronomy was written. So probably Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the entirety of that was read in front of them so that they knew what they were getting into. That's all from Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 1 through 8, according to what Moses had commanded. And at this point, we start seeing people included in the people of Israel as well that are from the Goyim, the nations. This is one of the first times we see the people included who are not Hebrew into the covenant of Israel with God. That is a precursor for how provision is going to be made for all the nations. And so now we have, they're a nation, the family is now made numerous, they now have a land, and the nations are being blessed through them. Genesis 12, 1 through 3 is already in many ways partially fulfilled by the time we get to Joshua chapter 8. Are you seeing that? That's how quickly all of this is moving, narratively. So, Israel's eventually deceived by this nation named Gibeon in Joshua chapter 9. The point to be made there is that even after they had reaffirmed the covenant, they then go cut a deal with these nations that they were never supposed to cut a deal with, and things go bad for them. Things go bad. This is where it becomes more and more difficult to restrain the faithful generation. Even though they're in the land, even though they have a great family that's numerous and that they are starting to bless the other nations, they are already starting to get off course. Are you tracking with that? That's already in Joshua chapter 9. Nope, not going to read anything else because we're taking too long. All right, so let's pick it up in chapter 11 and 12. Chapters 1 through 9 in Joshua really talk about the preparations to enter the land, Jericho, Ai, and that's it. There's no other battles really recorded. Chapters 11 and 12 are really about the preparations for the defeat of the rest of the land of Canaan, northern Palestine. They eventually conquer all of these northern kings, and these two chapters are really devoted to what would amount to like several years worth of fighting. The whole point here is we don't need to see how every one of these battles flow out. It's because the pattern's been set that spiritual fidelity is what wins the day, not tactics. So we don't need to talk about all that stuff over and over again, right? The battles were fierce, but what we need to see is verses 6 through 9 in chapter 11. So let's read chapter 11, 6 through 9. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them. The exact same thing he said to him in chapter 1. Don't be afraid of them. For tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses, burn their chariots with fire. And so Joshua and all his warriors came suddenly against them by the waters of Merman and fell upon them. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, who struck them and chased them as far as the great Sidon and Mesperoth, Meam, and eastward as far as the valley of Mitzvah. And they struck them until none were left remaining. And Joshua did to them just as the Lord had said. It doesn't matter what the details are narratively. He did everything God told him to do. That's why they win. Are you seeing that over and over again? And the Lord said to him, or just as the Lord said to him, and he humstrung their horses and he burned their chariots with fire. The main point for all of what is left to be done in Joshua is that they must obey. The paradigm for obedience must be followed if there is ever going to be any kind of blessing. From there, the conquest is over. We know that there's more fighting to be done, but the conquest is effectively over narratively. But here's the deal. The land is conquered, but it's not actually fully possessed yet. What we see from the very beginning of Judges, in Judges chapter 1 through 3, is we're going to see that Israel had left a whole lot of work left to be done. Most of that fell to the people of Judah. They failed to drive out the remaining nations, and that is the main key plot point for the rest of the book of Judges, all the way through 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, of what happens with these random people who are still in the land that Israel never took care of. Cool? Tracking with that? Questions? We're going to blow through the last bit of this. This is our last point on Joshua's farewell address. Anything? All right. So let's talk about Joshua's farewell address. Turn to... let me talk about what goes on in between here. Chapters 13 all the way through 22 of Joshua is about how the land is going to be allocated to different people. If we had more time, I would tell you, go look at a map. It's crazy. There's a whole bunch of land. The tribes are given their land, 13 through 22. Boom. Then we get to Joshua chapter 23 and chapter 24, and this is where everything comes to a head. Joshua's about to die. So before he does, he seriously charges the leaders of the nation. Look in chapter 23, verse 5. The Lord your God will push them back, these other nations. He will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess their land just as the Lord your God has promised you. Spiritual fidelity is the main issue, right? So he charges them. He says that God is going to drive out the rest of the Canaanites if you are faithful. He says there in verse 6, therefore, be very strong to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside neither to the right hand nor to the left. He says, cling to God. Do what he told you to do, cling to him, and then he says, hey, you've already seen God's faithfulness work out in this, yes? Look at verse 14. And now I am about to give you the way of all the earth, and you know in your hearts and souls, all of you, that not one word has failed from all the good things that the Lord your God has promised concerning you. All have come to pass for you. Not one of them has failed. He says, you've got to continue to be as faithful to God as he's been to you. That's just reaffirming the covenant, yeah? But then he also says in verse 15, but just as all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you have been fulfilled, so the Lord will also bring curses or evil upon you and destroy you from the good that God has given you if you are not faithful. This is in many ways just a mirror image of Joshua chapter 1. Joshua chapter 1, chapter 23 and 24 are mirror images of when Joshua begins and when Joshua ends his leadership, yeah? So he charges Israel, y'all have got to stay faithful to that end. In Joshua 24, verses 1 through 13, Joshua is then going to renew the covenant once again at Shechem, at this place there in the northern end of Palestine. And this is basically where we see the big line in chapter 24, verse 33. Oh, actually, we'll talk about 24, 33 in a second. Let's pick it up there in verse 18. And the Lord drove out all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in this land. Therefore, we will also serve the Lord, for he is our God. That's whenever they reaffirm this is who we're going to be. Cool. In many ways, there's a poetic death that happens here. Joshua dies there in chapter 24, verse 29. And then we see in verse 33, Eleazar We didn't talk about him in Numbers, but when Aaron died, his son Eleazar became the high priest. Eleazar, after Joshua, was the last person to actually see God's faithfulness through the book of Numbers and bringing them out of Egypt all the way through the wandering through the wilderness and now through the conquest. And he is the last person to die. Verse 33. And Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died, and they buried him at Gibeah, the town of Phinehas, his son, which had been given him in the hill country of Ephraim. Here's the point. They are told to serve with faithfulness. Problem is, the last two men who were actually faithful, Eleazar and Joshua, they're now dead. We know they didn't finish the job that they were told to do with not only complete the conquest and to possess the land, but they've got to get rid of all the other nations, and they don't do that. That's where we're going to pick it up tomorrow. So, this is where we've been. We've covered Israel there in Egypt with them being slaves. We eventually talked about how that moved them into Numbers. We talked all the way through Exodus, Numbers, and then Joshua, and that led us to his farewell address. This is where we will be tomorrow night. We're going to talk about Judges all the way to the monarchy, and then when the monarchy fails. We're going to talk about introduction to Judges, Samuel, the monarchy, Saul, David's ascent. We're going to talk about eventually Solomon, the monarchy under David, how it all falls apart. That's where we're heading. We're tracking with that? So, before we cut out of here, do we have any other questions so far? And I went about an hour and a half, so I went about 15 minutes longer than I was planning to. So, any questions so far about what was essentially Exodus all the way to the beginning of Judges? Comments, questions? Crystal? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question was, whenever we look in Joshua chapter 5, whenever Joshua runs into this random cat who's got a sword in his hand, and I called that a Christophany, or that's a physical manifestation of the pre-incarnate Christ. Well, how do we know that's the pre-incarnate Christ? The evidence there, which you just mentioned, was what we see there in verse 14. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" Him worshiping this figure only happens if that person is God. Because keep in mind, back in chapter 3 and 4, chapter 4 and 5 is about their spiritual fidelity. So on the high of them reaffirming the covenant, celebrating the Passover, circumcision, and then Jericho, all that sandwiched in there with their clear spiritual fidelity, it wouldn't make sense that in the very middle of that, there would be this idolatrous worship of something that's not God. Right? Makes sense? So narratively, that's right in the middle of all that. And so with him worshiping the commander of the army of the Lord, that is the pre-incarnate Christ. That's the pattern we'll see throughout the rest of the Old Testament of him showing up. So yeah, that's how we would say that is God himself. Yes. Yeah, well, in part. So the question was the gold, bronze, and the silver that's saved out of Jericho and Ai that's not devoted to destruction, but it is kept over. Where does that eventually end up? Well, one, that is eventually going to be taken into the tabernacle. They will use it. That's what they're going to pay for the conquest in many ways. So it's not just a pilfering or plundering in that regard. It is going to be used for the conquest and the establishment of the nation. But I would say some of that does show up in 1st and 2nd Chronicles whenever the temple starts getting built. In 2nd Samuel, whenever Solomon builds the temple, we eventually see it there. And David, when he builds the palace for the king, some of that does show up there. But that's years and years away. And we see that the tabernacle gets plundered more than once. And so I'm sure this has changed hands multiple times. Does that answer the question? Cool. Other questions? All right, has this been a helpful sprint? If you take nothing else away from the night, like last night we were talking about how there are these design patterns of how we see that even in the middle of failure, there's always this hope that's given right on the other side of it. Tonight the theme is that spiritual fidelity and faithfulness and obedience to God is what brings blessing, not military tactics, okay? Tomorrow, we're going to look at Judges. That cycle is going to become abundantly clear, okay? That is what the book of Judges is about. However, we're really not going to spend as much time in Judges as you might imagine, okay? So, let me pray for us, and then we will be done for the night. Father, I thank you for this hour-and-a-half sprint through Scripture. God, I pray that it has been beneficial. I know it's been a lot. God, I pray that it has been accurate. I pray it's been helpful. But more than anything, God, I pray that it has been honoring to you. I pray that we would take what we have learned tonight and what we've been exposed to be able to see how we are called to obedience, to see how even at the worship of the commander of the angel armies that we see, the angel or the army of the Lord there in Joshua 5, that same kind of worship is what is demanded of us every day because of how good you are to us. And that as a result of that, our obedience to you is demanded, and rightly so. And so, God, I pray that you would help us to understand how all of these things point to Christ. I pray that you would help us to understand how this is actually impactful for us today. And God, I pray that you would be honored by the way that we respond to what we've seen tonight. We thank you for this time. I pray that you will do with it as you will. I pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. Thank you guys for joining us online. All this stuff will be up. Hopefully there's questions that come later. I'll be able to answer that. If not, we're good to go.